I would like to introduce Things Fall Apart as a good example of a post-colonial piece of writing, as a piece of colonial writing, a very representative piece of such a mode of writing for many reasons. First of all, in the period it was written, 1958, a moment of decolonization, for the way it is written, and from the ideas it holds, and how the writer himself is conscious of the fact that he is not only writing a piece of art, but he is writing a committed piece for responding to a long history of a dominant, hegemonic culture of the white towards his African people. And the fact that Things Fall Apart comes at this period, it shows that the writer is aware of what was written about Africa, and by doing that, he tries to refute some of the biased representations of his own culture, and doing that, he represents an alternative. And Things Fall Apart is this kind of text which responds both on the level of the theme, on the structure, and the way if it is represented to this colonial gaze. I start this piece with the last sentence of Things Fall Apart. And this last sentence is very reflective of the colonial discourse that Chinua Achebe tries to refute. And at the end, after Okonkwo's and his friends struggled against the colonial presence, and because of the failure to respond to the machine of colonialism, he ends by killing himself and committing suicide. According to the Igbo people, is abomination. And he asked the commissioner, that is Mr. Smith, asked his clansmen to take this corpse of the Okonkwo, but they say that it was an abomination. And at the end, decided to write something, and this is what the commission said. He had already chosen the title of the book. So the commission has already, in his presence of Africa, chosen to write a book, and the title of this book is The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. And ironically, Mr. Smith the story here is going to take just a paragraph. The chosen title of the book and the Pacification of the Primitive will be a good paragraph for his book. And still, Mr. Smith is holding this colonial view and thinking that he comes to pacify the primitive tribes. While what Chinua Achebe, yes, he presents his novel, the important aspect of the Igbo culture, they are not primitive, they are not savage, they are people with their cultures, with their way of living. Yes, they have, as he said himself, there are imperfections, but they are not totally savage. And Okonkwo, and the commissioner imagined that Okonkwo and his suicide will make an interesting paragraph in the book that he is writing. Still, ironically, Mr. Smith has in his mind this colonial gaze of superiority over the other, and he could not understand the truth of this life of Umuofia. And this is a problem here with representation of the other and the truth of the other. And we have here the writer himself, Chinua Achebe, is facing this misrepresentation with presenting the truth. And borrowing from Ashcroft, Griffith, and Tiffin in their book, The Empire Writes Back, they say that in conquest and colonization, texts and textuality played a major part. European texts, anthropologies, histories, fiction, captured the non-European subject, like here people in Umuofia, within European frameworks which read his or her alterity as terror or lack. And this is one of the negative points of European textuality and other sources of science, anthropology, or history, or fiction. They always depict the other as a terror or lack in negative terms. And because the text, science, and textuality is always in service of colonization, and they try to give food colonization through these writing, which are which do not agree with the truth, but they are just representation giving colonizing food for and way and pretext for colonizing the other, who is always a terror lack, believing that the West is the source of the truth, the source of knowledge, which is in fact wrong. And since I'm talking about the discourse, the colonial discourse, meanings usually are constructed in and through system of representation. And they are mediated through dominant hegemonic discourses which can reproduce unequal social relations. And this is what these texts produce in the West, is that they try to reproduce this unequal social relations, and a representation become a discourse, and it involves social conventions, unequal power relationship, and that some people have more power to speak than others. And that is to say, the Western text is loaded with this powerful way of representation of the other, and which gives idea of the other as powerless. And the postcolonial studies examine various forms of representation, whether visual, textual, in relation to race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and other. So this is the object of postcolonial. It is to examine these forms of representation, and these representation usually include various aspects of social, political, and religious phenomena. They are thought to be realistic, but in fact not, as Edward Said has revealed that in his book Orientalism, and where he argues that representation can never be realistic because it is given through the lenses of this superior mind. And these representations are fabricated, mythical, stereotypical images, and which the superior culture is believed that they are having, and they are going to act via this misfabricated representation. And since I have mentioned Edward Said, as I had introduced him in his previous presentation on Orientalism, he says that the Orient is portrayed as an inferior and barbaric civilization by the West through a series of negative misrepresentation. And the mission of the West to bring enlightenment to dark. The other is the dark, the uncivilized. And it needs physical conquest as a means to bring the other to civilization. Let's go to the other to civilize and to bring light. And the Orient remains the object of the Western gaze, which defines the field representation promoted in the name of science. And this is very intricate because we have subjects reducing the other to the area of the object, means to conquer and to civilize. It highlights the dangerous power of literature, very important imperial conquest. And literature is an active force in the social contemporaneity and representation. A lot of texts, a lot of books were written promoting this fabricated mythical image of the other. And one of them is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and which is part of the colonial discourse, in which the African is represented by the European as savage, exotic, cannibal, and primitive. And Chinua Achebe himself attacked the teaching of certain novel which represents the African in this way, in this negative way. And this novel, as an example of the colonial discourse, shows the superiority of the whites in context where the blacks are considered to be irrational and the whites are supposed to be civilized. So literature in the service of the colonial mission. It views also the dark continent through Marlowe's the character train of thought, and he portrays the image of Africa as the other world, the problem of the other as barbarous and savage, self versus the other. And Africans are represented as silent and with no other occupations besides merging in the evil forest or materializing out of it. You can see that the view of someone coming to Africa and giving force to the colonial gaze, which of course Africans and writers like Chinua Achebe would not accept, because it is a wrong fabricated mythical image of the other, and it follows this colonial gaze and colonial discourse. It's giving power to the colonial discourse. And Marlowe character does not come across even a single instance of cannibalism. They thought that the other are barbarous, savage, and cannibals. And when these cannibals are very hungry, he wonders why they do not attack the whole crew. I might be eaten by them before long. And he interprets, which is a wrong interpretation, their gestures and murmurs as signs of their cannibalistic intention, based on wrong mythical belief that they are barbarous, and they have it in mind. And the African native is seen through European lenses. And as I said, the civilized European has the power to represent and speak about the silent native. And the silent native is that, as I said, is that because they have their own language, which is not known for the others and by the others. So that's why they say they are speechless and they cannot speak, they are silent. And as we have it in Chinua Achebe, there are people who speak. They have their stories, they have their song, they have their local practices. And the problem is that this problem of communication, language is not known. And the power to incorporate these into a colonial discourse and to present the European as superior, showing the African in prehistorical primitivism. And you can see here that literature, it is in the service of the colonial discourse, representing this prehistorical primitive man as a static image which does not change. And William Taylor says that these European writers believed that colonialism was an agent of enlightenment to primitive peoples without a valid system or civilization of their own. And this is a wrong belief. And this idea of enlightenment as if the others were living in the dark, which is wrong. And Conrad himself, representation, considered the white colonizer as the white emissaries of light, spreading civilization among illiterate blacks. This problem of the other, the white versus the black, the known and the unknown. Just because the other is unknown, we have to reflect on this unknown as a danger. Now, seeing this whole series of beliefs, wrong belief, mythical fabricated representation, which the colonial discourse believes in, the coming of the writings of the local culture and the representative figures like Chinua Achebe are seeing that their role and their historical role is to commit themselves to write back to this wrong fabricated misrepresentation. And colonized writers in Africa and in other places after this period, they are writing back, and they're writing back responding to this wrong representation. And the advocate representation of the oppression and racism of the colonizer and the inherent culture of the indigenous people. And this is what happens after colonialism, the emergence of what you call resistance literature. It is varied, different, and also rich in its response. But sometimes it remained prey to the language of the empire to contest its dominant ideology and to refute further subjugation. Very problematic here, because when these writers are writing back, and because they were educated in the language of the colonizers, they were forced into a dilemma. And Achebe himself, that I have been given this language, I have to use this language. And the only thing is that the message should be given through this language. And Helen Tiffin states that post-colonial literature and culture are thus constituted in counter-discursive rather than homologous practices, and they offer fields of counter-discursive rather than homologous discourse. In other words, that this post-colonialism is trying to differentiate itself and present a different view from the one which was predominant throughout periods. And the counter-discourses sometimes fails to recognize its ground, either by existence to react against the colonizer representation or to resist their dominant ideology. That is to say, the discourse of empire is so historically engraved in society and strongly is that these post-colonials find it sometimes difficult to be recognized because of the hegemony, the continuous hegemony of the colonial machine. Tiffin again says that post-colonial cultures are inevitably hybridized, involving a dialectical relation between European ontology and the impulse to create independent local identity. This is also another important fact. When we try to handle a text from a post-colonial perspectives, we are in front of this dilemma of the continuity of the colonial history, the colonial reflection in these texts. So that's why these texts are hybrids, because they are the outcome of a mixture of both what is European and what is local. And in the text itself, we find Europe and its other at the same time. And what the writer tried to do is that to find a compromise between complete separation from the empire and the complete dependence upon the empire for its existence. It is a very epistemological and existential dilemma that the post-colonial is referring. How far can he go from this idea of the empire and the colonial and reflect on the identity of his own local country, culture, and people? And African post-colonial narratives have emerged to resist the inaccurate and negative picture of the African people. This is true. It is the idea of showing one's own identity. And Things Fall Apart, as I said, it is a post-colonial text as it defends the African heritage we can see, for example, in my present in the first part. It tries, that's one of the aim of this text, is to correct the distorted images of the past produced by many Western writers, including Conrad, that is to say, to correct some wrong images produced by these writers as being living in the dark continent and being primitive, savage, while Achebe is given a different definition and different presentation. And it also reflects the mood of representations, including the social, political aspect of the Igbo society before and after the coming of the white man. And what Achebe, for example, is trying to do is that he tries to give us a picture of his own culture, on his people, and the cultural practice before the coming of the white man, and what happens after the coming, the changes that is this Igbo culture underwent through the coming of the white man. And what Achebe does is that he creates a complex and sympathetic portrait of a traditional village culture in Africa, mainly the Igbo society. Yes, we sympathize with the example of these people. It is a true picture of such a traditional village culture. And as we see that the writer himself tried to be somehow objective by giving the positive and the negative aspect of this culture. And he informs us about the Igbo culture, reminds his people of their valuable past, and proves that his society is not lacking value, but it has an identity of great depth and respect. And this is what the aim of Achebe is, that is giving this dignity back to his own people by appreciating the existence of such a society and a culture. And as he said in one of his articles, The Novelist as a Teacher, I would be quite satisfied, he says, if my novels, especially the ones I set in the past, did no more than teach my readers that their past, with all its imperfection, was not one long night of savagery. No, it's not one long night of savagery, but it is a history of local, cultural, philosophical, and existential presence of a certain tribe, certain people at a certain time. And they are human beings like other human beings. And that's enough for an answer, a post-colonial answer to the colonial machine, as I said. And also in his article, The Role of the Writer in a New Nation, he says that the past needs to be recreated. And you can see that with Achebe is that, and also post-colonial, it is always we have recreating. replacing and trying to re-empower the local culture. And Achebe here is aware of that. He said that the past needs to be recreated not only for the enlightenment of our destructors, but even more for our education. So very important is that writing one's own culture, one's own history, has the purpose of giving it as a means of education and for moving forward. And you can see it is a moment of empowerment and trying to relocate one's existence after the colonial destruction of such a culture. And what he does in Things Fall Apart, in fact, it is a response, as I said, to the misrepresentation of Africa and Africans in Western literature. Sure, it is a direct response to the negation of the culture of the other. As a Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad represents the image of Africa as other world, and it is full of grotesque caricature as it portrays life in the African bush as lawless and primitive, and Africans are depicted as strings of dusty niggers, the negative picture of these people. Also, Achebe, of course, rebels against this misrepresentation, and he presents, on the opposite, life as civilized and stable, not primitive and chaotic. It is with the advent of the white man that things fall apart. And when I read Things Fall Apart as a post-colonial text, and this is the rule, yes, it is written in English, but the content is meant to react to writings of the Western production to say that no, it is false, and he rewrites his wrong misrepresentation. Landforce supports Achebe's idea is that the white men were not bringers of light to a dark continent, as was popularly supposed, and their civilization mission did not result in peace, order, and harmony. On the opposite is that they were living in peace, order, and harmony, and it is with the white presence that people were in a loss and chaos reigned. What we can say here is that with Achebe, like others, we have an Afro-centric representation rather than a Euro-centric perspective in the colonial discourse. We have the use of the African language, and it includes some aspect of the culture of Africa. It is meant here to magnify the presence of such a language. And Yomufia also, the Yomufian tribe has specific rituals and charms represented by the feature of ceremonies, such as singing, dancing, drumming, and sacrificing, which means it exists a whole culture with all its manifestation. And it locates an accurate picture of the African culture within the framework of the word culture. It is part of the word culture. Also a proverbial saying, source of wisdom and knowledge to explain culture and tribal recognition. And it shows that these people have their own language, and it is full of wise sayings, means of knowledge, which is source of knowledge and also source of education. Also in the texts, it is an attempt to correct the bias, as I said, distorted image of Africa. And that's important for us in reading the text as a postcolonial one, because it means it is to subvert the wrong image and to correct the distort and to relocate the culture in the correct order, and to counter the misrepresentation of the African in the colonial text by making Yomufia a historical, social, cultural presence. This is very important here, is that relocate this culture in the proper context as a reaction to the colonial discourse. It does not seek to idealize the African space as a European, utopian counter to European wrong view. No, it is sometimes an objective presentation of an African space system like any other, and it is somehow objective. We have two contrastive images of Yomufia, the old traditional way of life, and the moment when torn by the negation of the white oppressors of the cultural inheritors. It shows also the conflict becoming how the old traditional way is strong, but with the strength of the white man, it is going to lose its existence means that the white man is responsible for the destruction of such a culture. The triumph of the colonizers and machinations of colonizers is very important. It is narrated in the novel as responsible for the loss of such culture. It presents the past objectively as admirable, pointing out its good, positive, as well as its negative side. And this is a logical part of a writer who is using reason in order to respond to unreasonable response of the colonial discourse. It shows the flaws of Mafia, criticizing them in order to reflect on them, changing them, and shows that his society is too inflexible and incapable of adapting with the new regime. Diana Rose says that Chinua Achebe does so both because he holds his own art to a standard of truth and because he sees that the history he is trying to recreate to give his people dignity will be credible only if he includes faults. And very clear that Chinua Achebe is going to be credible because he's showing reality as it is without exaggeration and without cosmetics, because he tries to say, here is my culture, here is myself with all the things, and here are some faults that should be corrected, like in any culture, like in other civilization. We exist, and this is who we are. And Christianity, with the coming of the white man, provides answers to questions people are seeking. The Igbo religion appears to be false, and the new religion is the sound option. And we are talking about Noye, his son here, rejection of both his father and the traditional religion, showing that some of the wrong practices in our culture, like this exaggeration in masculinity, this violence, physical violence, which his son Noye sees, is that he is looking for answers, and these answers are to be found in the coming of the Christian mission. And Noye, the gentle son who cannot accept Okonkwo's harshness, and especially his killing of Ekomofuna, finds in the poetry of Christianity the promise of brotherhood. Achebe shows that some of the mistakes in Igbo culture quickly help Christianity to settle in this land. And Noye and other converted natives keep in their mind that their society would not stay static due to the fast growth of the world. And we can see that one of the things that when the white man comes is that in the evil forest he starts to build his institution. One of them is the church, and the church is the beginning of conversion. And we know the importance of the missionaries in bringing Christianity to the Africans. And the boundaries of various cultures will forcibly overlap. And with the coming of the white man, now converted people start to be attracted to the new culture, and quickly there is this overlapping of the two parts. And to avoid the loss of Umuofia's community, the inhabitants would seek a compromise coexistence between the Christian mission and the clansmen. So there is a period of compromise between their own and the foreigner. Also, this shows the flexibility of culture. Though there is the omnipresence of the colonial presence, we have also the flexibility of the local culture. Portraying the indigenous culture in post-colonial writings, Achebe here attempts to discredit the blind truths of Africa presented in colonial discourse, and this is a criticism to this dominant colonial discourse. And the most dangerous type of representation is the one that constructs realities and misrepresent them in order to serve one's political agenda. And what Achebe does is that he tries to rewrite his own culture, his own history, in order to recorrect the distorted image which give Europeans pretext to control and to dominate others. And this is why it is a post-colonial text. As a conclusion, I can say first that Things Fall Apart, it is a novel which is appropriating the form, because in Africa we have this predominance of orality. The oral was predominant, but this act of borrowing the novel, which is a Western form. Also, we have this orality, it is language. So appropriation of novel text, appropriation of language, which is English, and the outcome is producing a hybrid text, which is loaded with local content and with a foreign form and language, and it celebrates the local culture. Also, the outcome is addressing the epistemic violence exercised by the colonial gaze, and the idea here is that writing a novel like this is to show the violence exercised upon the culture and the violence exercised through the colonial discourse and its misrepresentation of the other. And at the end, we can say that with Achebe doing that, he creates a third space, using Homi Bhabha's words, a third space to possibly negotiate new grounds resulting from the contact zone. There is a contact zone there. We have the local and we have the foreign, and we have the historical meeting point between the two. And what happens is that we come up with a third element, which is an African novel, but with some European elements, including both language and the form.